Welcome to Post-Carbon Radio, where we explore the ways in which we can and must power down in a new era that is no longer exploiting our fellow human and ecosystems. We believe in building up our community resilience, expecting further economic collapse in the face of abrupt giant climate change, in the end of cheap oil, the depletion of our natural resources, and a possible mass extinction event on our planet. I'm Bing Gong, and my usual co-host, Bernie Stephan, is taking a break from the show today, and Herb Cutchins is joining me as a guest co-host. Herb is a professor emeritus at California State University and a regular programmer on KWMR's Open House. Welcome, Herb. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Bing.
I do have a little more introduction.
Okay,
and I was just going to say that today our program is about water. The blue gold that flows so freely from our faucets, the water we take for granted. But water is precious. 90% of our body weight is water. There is no life without water. Wars are fought over water. And with climate change, there is now drought in the Midwest. In California, there are predictions of less snowpack in the winter in the Sierras, and therefore less runoff later in the year. And it will be more arid in the southern part of the state. And currently in California, there is a mega water project being planned, and so today we are airing the issues on California's water future. We'll be talking about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan and the Delta Tunnel Plan.
Now is the time when I get to introduce Jerry Meral, who is, in fact, the man of the hour on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And a little bit about Jerry Meral. First of all, he is a local resident here in Inverness. He was retired until he selflessly decided to rejoin Jerry Brown's administration to head up this project. Prior to that, he had a prior history with Jerry Brown's first administration back in the 70s. And following that, he was director of the executive director of the Planning and Conservation League. Jerry, we'd like to welcome you, and perhaps you can unveil the mysteries, of which there are many, about the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. I even have trouble remembering all the initials, so tell us more.
Well, I'd first like to introduce our guest on the telephone today in Sacramento is Jonas Minton, a water policy advisor for the Planning and Conservation League. Founded in 1972, the PCL provides research that serves as a catalyst for public policy change to solve critical environmental problems. He's been working on issues surrounding water use and water policy issues for over 20 years. Jonas is a former Deputy Director of the California Department of Water Resources, and he served on a team that secured federal wild and scenic river protection for more than 1,200 miles of California rivers. Jonas Minton, you're welcome to Post Carbon Radio.
Good afternoon, Herb, Bing, Jerry. Good to talk with you all.
Glad to talk to you. Let's turn back to Jerry Meral now and have him tell us the basic outlines of this very complex plan.
Okay, well, thank you, Herb and Bing, for having both of us on the show today. Certainly a timely topic. It's certainly visible in the newspapers these days, the governor's water plan. And you've picked maybe two guests that are more closely bound than you think, because when Jonas worked on that Wild Rivers plan, he was working for me when I was Deputy Director of Water Resources, so we go back a long ways. The governor's plan is pretty straightforward, really. It's trying to solve environmental and water supply problems at the same time in the Delta. And it's being done through the method of trying to comply with the state and federal Endangered Species Acts. We have 57 different species in the Delta that are of concern, plants, animals, fish, and so on, wildlife, and a lot of other species that aren't even listed in that list, like waterfowl, that we are trying to protect and enhance. And under state law, we have state and federal endangered species laws. The state law is very strong and says that you not only must avoid jeopardy for these species, but in fact you must contribute to the recovery. And our goal is to try to help these species recover and at the same time maintain the state's delta water supply, which is very important. About 20%, a little less than 20% of our state's water comes from the delta, and that includes all the water for northern Contra Costa County, 80% for southern Alameda, about half for Santa Clara County, and then anywhere from 25 to 70 or more percent in the San Joaquin Valley and about a third of Southern California. So even though it's only 20% of the water, it is a very large share of our urban water supply in California.
Not only that, where the water comes from is a very critical point for the delta, which is the heart of the water system in California. Let's talk a little about the tunnels themselves. The tunnels are designed, I believe, to bypass, in some ways, the delta, although my current understanding is that they begin around Hood, which is in the upper delta, and they will go about 35 miles. Why don't you tell us?
That's right. Yes, you've got it right. A part of this plan is to avoid the problem we have today that we're diverting water at the South Delta that's very harmful to fish. And so we have a lot of fish in the South Delta that get trapped by the pumps and even exported down south. We want to avoid that. And to do that, the idea is to build these tunnels, which were first proposed by the old California Department of Fish and Game about 50 years ago. It's now called Fish and Wildlife, as a means of avoiding a fish trap, in a sense. Now, in fact, not all the water would be diverted into the tunnels. Even if they were built, about half the water would continue to come out of delta channels. We think we can, by reducing it that much, we can avoid these fish trapping problems. So it would be a mixed system. But we are trying to follow what the fish agencies have said for a long time is necessary.
So let's describe the tunnels. The tunnels are 35 miles long. Mm-hmm. They're 35 or more feet in diameter. Is that correct? And there are two of them. Those sound enormous. When we think about it, there is no building that high in anywhere here in West Marin, as far as I know.
Oh, that's right. We have a 25-foot coastal permit limit, so of course not.
But if we look at the facade of the Grandy building, that in itself is about almost no more than half the height, roughly, or maybe 2/3.
Well, I don't know. Grandy could be 30, but whatever. It's something in that range. The reason is, this is perfect for post-carbon radio, I have to say. The reason for the large size is because we want to have the water flow by gravity. We don't want to pump it. Now, there would probably have to be some pumps to pump it out of the river, but we don't want to have to pump it all the way across the delta. And so we could avoid huge energy investment by making the tunnel larger. And when you do that, you have a bigger facility, but you can go by gravity. The smaller the tunnel gets, the more you'd probably have to pump it. So we save a huge amount of energy by using gravity flow.
And then there's the question, the part of the plan as to what you do with this large amount of land that you're going to be digging out to
yes.
put the tunnels in. Why don't you talk about that and perhaps talk about what's going on in the Delta and the Delta Islands?
Sure. So that's very appropriate. The material that you excavate while you're digging the tunnel with these big tunnel boring machines will be dirt. I mean, it's just whatever's underneath the delta. It's never been disturbed by humans. It won't have any toxic materials in it. It's primordial in a sense. And we think that material will be extremely valuable. The people in the delta we're talking to now already say, gee, could we have some of that to fill in low spots in islands? Can we use it to bolster levees? Can we use it to restore habitat? So actually I think that there'll be already is in fact a pretty high demand for that material, and it'll be clean. We will be adding materials to it that make tunnel boring machines work, but they're not toxic, and this has been done elsewhere. In the South Bay, they just built a very large tunnel, the Irvington Tunnel replacement, underneath the bay, actually the first tunnel underneath the bay, interestingly enough. And they used almost all the material to restore wetlands in the South Bay Refuge. So we're pretty confident that this material will be pretty usable and will be in high demand. But it is a large volume. It's millions of cubic yards because this is a very long tunnel. Even though it's narrow in a sense, it's still got to go a long ways.
And I think we're going to turn to Bing and his discussion with Jonas Minton. So let's hear from them now.
Yeah, Jonas, I'd like to bring you in the conversation. You have a critique of the Delta Tunnel project, and what are the alternatives? I think there's a portfolio of other solutions.
Thank you. First, let me say that we agree with Jerry Meral and the Brown administration that the Delta needs improvement. Let's just remind our listeners where the Delta is. Not everybody knows it. It's an area of about 700,000 acres. It's sort of triangular shaped, sort of Sacramento to Tracy, that's by Stockton, and then over there by Rio Vista. So it's a pretty big area. In fact, it is the largest estuary on the west coast of the hemisphere. So it's a very important biological resource. One of the things that is concerning to us is what the people who will get water expect to get. It's a pretty expensive project. Around $25 billion is the current estimate. Just by way of time, 7 years ago it was estimated at $3 billion. So now it's up to $25 billion. Our concern is that when water interests in Southern and Central California pay that much money, they are going to want to get a lot of water from the Delta. What we've learned in the past 50 years is that the water diverted from the Delta, sometimes called exported from the Delta, has had major impacts. We've seen a crash of fisheries dependent on that estuary, dependent in large part on the fresh water coming into and going out of the estuary. That's not to say that water diversions are the only cause for this environmental collapse, but independent scientists have agreed that the Delta needs more water. The theory behind this project makes some sense. It's called big gulp, little sip. And what that means is that in wet years, when there's excess water, when it's flooding, more water will be diverted, including through these large tunnels. The trade-off would be that in dry years, such as the one we're experiencing now, diversions would be less than they would otherwise. So big gulp, little sip. The concern is that after these Southern California, Central California water interests pay upwards of $25 billion, it'll convert into big gulp, big gulp. And everybody has been wrestling for decades to try and identify, are there any possible assurances that that would not occur? The other thing that's troubling to us is the sequence by which this project would proceed. We believe that the first step should be identifying how much fresh water the Delta needs. That kind of tells you how much water is left for beneficial uses elsewhere in the state. However, the current approach is one of build it now and figure it out later. Again, that causes us concerns when people with a lot of money and a lot of votes in Southern and Central California, once it's built, who will set the rules? It won't be Jerry Meral. I would trust Jerry to do a great job. But over the next 50 years, Jerry's going to move on to other good things.
Don't count on it.
So those are some of our concerns, and that caused us to suggest an alternative, one that would have a tunnel, but a much smaller tunnel, and it would take the savings, the significant cost savings, and invest them in water conservation, water recycling, stormwater capture, particularly in Southern California. We know that much of the water diverted from this delta goes down this long canal to uses in those areas where it's used once and then discharged to the ocean. We think that in this climate change world, we can no longer afford to do that. By investing in those kinds of programs, we reduce the need and could actually reduce the total volume of exports from the delta. So that's kind of what our alternative focuses on.
Let me ask Jerry a question. Jonas mentioned that the plan would cost $25 billion, but I'm not sure if that includes like interest on any bonds that are put forward, or what?
Well, there's a lot of ways of looking at it. The capital costs of the project, the tunnels, if you built them today, would probably be in the $14 or so billion range. The habitat restoration that we want to do is a very important part of the plan. This would be the largest habitat restoration program ever undertaken in the western United States. That would be $4 to $5 billion. So those are the upfront costs. And then you can add in costs like operations, maintenance, interest, and get it up as high as you want. But I think most people want to know, if you built it today, what's it going to cost? Those would be the numbers. The costs of doing these tunnels would be borne by the water users, including mitigation for the tunnels. And the general public would pay for the habitat restoration, as is pretty typically done in these habitat conservation plans.
I think this is an important part that we've been talking about, but talking around, which is the financing, which, as you've pointed out, will not be public financing. The last time there was an attempt to do something like that, you were involved in that, in the original Jerry Brown administration, failed because it was, in part, because it was a publicly financed program, and for some other reasons as well. But this means that since there is no public financing in terms of a bond issue that will be before the public will not this time be voting directly on whether we should have a tunnel program or not.
Well, it's true. There is public financing for the habitat part, and there's a bond on the ballot today that would be voted on next November if it stays on the ballot, that includes some funding for habitat. So there is a possibility the public would vote on the habitat, but as you say, not on the tunnel part. Last time, in fact, it was assumed the contractors would pay most of those costs, but the reason it appeared on the ballot was a referendum that was placed on through the signature process. So that's how it got on the ballot.
And can you perhaps anticipate this happening now, contrary to your plan that there may be groups that will want to do this that are opposed to
there's nothing to put on. There's a subtle difference between a referendum and an initiative. A referendum is where the legislature passes a law, the voters for some reason don't like it, they gather signatures, and they put the law on the ballot. That can't be done here. There's no current law to referend. But someone could do an initiative. They could gather signatures and say, we don't like this or whatever, make it illegal. They could go through the initiative process. There's no sign of that happening right now, but it theoretically is possible.
Let's talk about one more thing, which is the current plan to get this forward. Right now, you're in the process of working out the plan in some detail, and some chapters have been released. Is that correct?
Right. There's on the website, BayDeltaConservationPlan.com. I encourage all of your listeners to go to that site and see what we've got there. We have all of the draft environmental impact statement and the draft of the plan itself. I have to tell you, for full disclosure, that's about 25,000 pages.
Oh,
but we have a lot of very concise summary material that you'll be able to use. And that's just the administrative draft. Sometime this fall, we'll put on the website the actual for public comment draft, and then people can send in their official comments.
And the comment draft will be for the EIS-EIR. How does the EIS-EIR fit into this time schedule?
The same thing. So we'll put the plan out and we'll put the EIS out, and the EIS looks into the environmental impacts of the plan itself.
Okay, so it will be the fall when it becomes a public matter for public discussion.
That's right.
Yeah, this is Post Carbon Radio. We're talking to Jerry Meral, who's heading up the Bay Delta plan with the Delta tunnels, and Jonas Minton in Sacramento. We'll be opening up our lines at the half hour, and you can also email me any questions or comments that you have at bingong@sonic.net. And Jonas, would you like to weigh in on the conversation?
There are a couple things that I would add. As Jerry noted, there's a lot of material that's been produced. I'm reminded of that quote by UCLA basketball coach John Wooden. His quote was, "Never mistake activity for progress." Jerry Meral is one of the smartest, most accomplished water managers I have ever met in my 35 years.
He's blushing.
However, he has such a Herculean task, which is why many of the most important issues are still unresolved. And these are some of them. One of them is, well, how would these tunnels be operated? Which is to say, how much water would be diverted in what years? A critical question. Another one is, amongst those water users, those interests in southern and central California, how much are they willing to pay or able to pay for a share? And this is the subject of intense discussion among those water interests. And a third major issue is this project permittable under the federal and state Endangered Species Acts? As Jerry pointed out, in the spirit of public disclosure, for which we commend them, they've put out pre-draft information about the environmental impact report and environmental impact statement. However, those state and federal permitting agencies have not really given it a particularly good grade, identifying areas of inadequacy, perceived bias in the materials. So it's very difficult what Jerry is trying to do for the Brown administration, and most of the key points are still unresolved.
Jerry, do you have some things you want to say about it?
Well, that's not inaccurate in that it's true. We haven't settled on any final operating plan. The financing is still unresolved. The water contractors who have to pay for this are still discussing how to do that. But it's, as they say in Britain, early days, even though this program has been going on for 7 years at great expense. And when we put out the official draft, we hope to resolve a lot of these issues. We had a statement from the National Marine Fisheries Service that they have some level of confidence that while they did raise some important points, that we can resolve them in time to put out a official draft of the plan and the EIS this fall. So Jonas is right, a very complicated plan, very complex in its financing and operation, and we are not done by any means, but hopefully when we come up with a draft, we'll have something to really people can get their teeth into.
One other point, the legislature, some people have described what the legislature, the California state legislature did is to punt. They have essentially created a situation where they're not going to have to vote on the specifics. Again, this sounds very complicated. Can you explain that?
Well, in 2009, the legislature passed a whole package of bills. Some of them dealing with this subject. They created the Delta Stewardship Council. They gave a whole lot of criteria that they wanted to include if this program went forward in the EIS, a lot of very specific alternatives we had to look at. They talked about financing. And I wouldn't say it's fair to say they punted. They really addressed this issue. Now, the legislation didn't pass unanimously. The people in the Delta didn't like it, and some environmental groups didn't like it. But it did pass. The governor signed it, and we are following it. They also passed a bill saying that the urban water users of California have to reduce their water use 20% by the year 2020. And for the theme of the show here, Post-Carbon Radio, water in its various uses is the largest energy user in California in terms of pumping it, heating it, disposing it, and so on. So reducing the water use in urban areas is tremendously important from an energy point of view, and I think maybe one of the best things they did in that legislation.
So the legislation has passed that essentially created the framework, and you referred to an organization that I'd like you to explain a little further, the
Delta Stewardship Council.
Right, but
right.
But they will not then have to go back to it and approve what you come up with.
Well, that's right. The only thing the legislature would have to do is that they put the Bond Act that we described earlier on the ballot for next year. Actually, they put it on in 2010, and it's been deferred twice because of bad polling, basically. And if they wanted to put it off again, they would have to act each time they did that, or they could amend it. Some people have said it should be amended. But they don't have to specifically act on the proposed Bay Delta Conservation Plan. They sort of authorized it in 2009.
Well, I think we're going to take a short break. You're listening to KWMR, Community Radio for West Marin, Point Reyes Station, and Bolinas, 90.5 FM Point Reyes Station, and 89.9 Bolinas, and streaming live at kwmr.org. This is Post Carbon Radio with Bing Gong and guest host Herb Cutchins, and we're joined in the studio by Jerry Meral and on the phone Jonas Minton, and we're talking about the issues on California's water future, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, and the Delta Tunnel Plan. And we're going to open up our phone lines now for any comments and questions. So listeners, you can call 415-663-8317. That's 415-663-8317. Or email me at bingong, all one word, BINGGONG at sonic.net, and I'll try to get your question on the air.
Let's talk a little more. Well, hopefully we'll get some calls on this, but I want to bring back a ghost that you may not want to remember. But the Chronicle in April said, Jerry Meral, tunnels won't save Delta. And it's claimed that you said that the tunnels won't save the Delta. How do you explain that?
Well, I'm sure the Chronicle was right in a sense. Certainly, no one in the Delta would think that they're being saved by building any tunnels. There's a lot of pieces to saving the Delta. We need to work on the levees. We need to work on land use and prevent inappropriate land use. We need to restore fish and wildlife. And no one plan, even the whole Bay Delta Conservation Plan, will save the Delta all by itself. We need a combined state program. Actually, Jonas might want to comment on that because he's working on short-term fixes to Delta problems. So I think that the Chronicle is right. The tunnels wouldn't save the Delta, but we can do a lot to save the Delta in a lot of different ways.
We have a caller, so we'll come back to this at a later point.
Hello, caller. You're on the air. Identify yourself and tell us where you're calling from.
Yes, this is Gray Brecken at the University of California at Berkeley.
Hi, Gray. Gray.
Hello.
This is Bing.
What has been missing from the discussion so far is both history and politics. And anybody who's aware of water in California realizes that these are inextricably mixed together. And in particular, the reason that the Delta is in such dire environmental shape at this point is largely because of the California State Water Project, which was, of course, the dream child, I should say the wet dream, of Jerry Brown's father, Pat Brown. And in an interview that he did with the Regional Oral History Office here at the Bancroft Library, he admitted to Malka Schall that he actually lied to the people of California in drastically underestimating the cost of the State Water Project, but that was only the economic cost. Of course, the environmental cost wasn't considered at all. Now, here at the University of California, we had a magnificent Water Resource Center archive built up over 50 years, which was absolutely essential for understanding what's happening to water in California. And 3 years ago, that was actually the administration had that moved down to University of California Riverside, and it's recently essentially been put out of existence. The Water Resource Center archive, as I say, was absolutely critical for not only scholars like myself, because I used it for writing my dissertation, but also for journalists to understand what California water politics is and why we've gotten into such a mess. I wonder if Jerry Meral actually can tell us something about what happened to the Water Resource Center archive, which I'm sure he must be very familiar with.
Well, I was a donor to it, and I'm appalled to hear you say that it's no longer in existence. I gave a lot of material to the archive. I know they moved it to Riverside, but that was the last I had heard, and I'm sorry to hear if it's no longer functioning, because I totally agree that scholars like yourself and many others have used that archive for a lot of research over the years, so I'm sorry to hear that if that's the case.
Well, there should actually be an investigation, a state investigation into what actually happened. The man who did that was a San Joaquin Valley grower and attorney who was appointed to a high position in the UC administration, Dan Dooley. He had no academic qualifications, and he was the man who made the decision to send it down there. It was a standalone collection, and it's now, as I understand, being blended into the rest of the collection after being 3 years with no acquisition. So it essentially is ceasing to exist, and unfortunately, I'm not sure what's going to happen to your papers. It's a tragic loss to California and actually to the world.
Let's talk about the underlying thing that our caller, which is that history. Pat Brown's original water plan, which, oversimplifying it as I do regularly, essentially shipped a lot of Delta water over the Tehachapies to Southern California and in the way that the people who are most disturbed by it would say, to fill the swimming pools of Southern California. And sometimes I think that what Jerry's trying to do is to straighten out his pop's mess. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, first, it's important to put everything in perspective. The California State Water Project exports somewhere over 2 million acre-feet a year by itself to the Bay Area, actually a lot, to the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California. That's a pretty tiny fraction of the total use of water in the Central Valley, but it's an important fraction. Everyone agrees with that. The Central Valley Project actually is a larger export of water. They actually export more water. But we need to look at the Delta as a whole and look at the export of water, as Gray has written about very expertly, by San Francisco and East Bay Mud, who really don't contribute an awful lot to the health of the Delta. They do environmental compliance upstream. And try to treat the Delta as a whole. The exports are really important. Everyone agrees with that. The impact of upstream dams and reservoirs, of global warming, which is really changing the way the Delta works. We can't deal with these things just in isolation. So we're going to have to deal with them at the State Water Board, where they deal with it sort of globally, and also through the other regulatory processes that we have.
Again, some critics have raised the issue that to take the flip side of what you're saying, that this is just the beginning, that this will lead to further incursions upstream on several rivers and raise the Shasta Dam, that this is in the offing as part of the results of this kind of activity.
Well, it's sort of odd to say this, but this project is actually about accommodation to climate change. What we're going to see in the Sierra is a change from a snow regime to a rain regime. And that's a terrible loss, because the reservoirs we really have in the state that do the most for us are the snow reservoirs. They accumulate huge amounts of water. The water melts gradually. It comes off in a nice, even sort of way, and we can make use of it in the time of year that we need it. And as we shift into more of a rain regime, we're going to see big storms in the Sierra. They're going to come down really fast. They're going to cause flooding probably, and we're going to have to change the way we manage water in the state. And part of that is going to impact the Delta. And so we include in our habitat development work in this program accommodation space. So, for example, in the tidal marsh that we want to create, 65,000 acres of tidal marsh, we also have to acquire land upstream.
Where would that be located?
That would be mostly in the northern Delta, sort of in Solano County and Yolo County. And we also have to acquire, ultimately, land that's at a higher elevation to accommodate sea level rise. So the whole program is very responsive to climate change. We think it is. And we have to be aware that the Delta is going to change, and our whole state water picture is going to change as well.
I just want to check and make sure. Jonas, are you still with us?
I am.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let me just observe a couple of things. The first is that the Delta is a very complex ecosystem. It has been damaged by a variety of land use actions, as well as the increased diversions. And the comment about learning from history is quite appropriate in this case. We can look at estuaries and riverine systems around the world to see what happens when fresh water is reduced. A close example is the Trinity River, not too far from you all up the coast. And back when major diversions were accomplished, you might say, from that river, its health just plummeted. Well, people said, let's do a lot of habitat work. Let's create more spawning areas for the fish and so forth. None of those worked. What the river needed was water. And as a result of some actions over the past decade, the river got more water and the fish got healthier. So there's some lessons that history can provide us here. And in this case, taking more fresh water from the delta, or even taking these historic high amounts from the delta, is likely just to have the same result, continued degradation on the path to extinction for several of the species.
So what is the way out of this? I'll address this to both Jerry and Jonah.
Well, I think we probably both say the same thing. We need to do more water conservation, more wastewater recycling, more groundwater storage, because that's a good way of doing the big gulp that Jonas described, and do what the legislature said we have to do, reduce reliance on the delta. That was part of that big law that was passed in 2009. It said you must reduce future reliance on the delta. I think everyone agrees with that. There's no great benefit to anyone in the state to take water out of the delta if they can use their own resources, and so we want to encourage that, and we want to invest state bond funds and other funds in that very program.
This is Jonas. Let me add a bit more. Jerry is correct that the legislation called for reduced reliance on water from the delta. However, there is a fundamental disagreement about what that means. Now, some people would say a plain reading is that there would be less water diverted from the delta. But those who would pay the $25 billion or more say it means something else. It means that they would, in essence, take the same amount, but for their future increases in demand, they would meet those from local sources. So their position, as I understand it, is, and it wiggles a little bit, it varies a little, is that they want to be able to continue to take as much water as they could have taken, which is even more than they did in some cases, as much water as they could have taken in the past. And so that semantic difference has real meaning. And that's one of the issues that Jerry is wrestling with pretty much on a daily basis with those who would pay. Does reduced reliance on the delta actually mean reduced diversions from the delta?
Would you like to?
Well, I would say that that's right, even more so in a way. The amounts that were taken in the early part of this century were pretty large, and we've told the water diverters that they are highly unlikely, virtually very unlikely, to ever get back to those kinds of levels. So I agree that it's very likely in the future that the amount of water exported from the delta will go down as compared to what we diverted in the past, just because of climate change, which has a huge impact, and because of increasing levels of regulation to protect the fisheries. And that's even if we do this project. If we don't do this project, the delta is subject to a lot of perturbations, earthquakes, and so on, and we could have levee collapses, and also there could be increased regulations. So I think it's a question of how much it's going to go down, not whether it's going to go back up.
I'd like to remind our listeners you can join the conversation by calling 415-663-8317. That's 415-663-8317.
And we're talking to Jerry Meral, who's heading up this Mammoth Water Project, and Jonas Minton, who has some relatively friendly criticisms, most of which Jerry seems to agree with. So, but let's talk about two parts of it. One, we've talked about the water research, the people who are going to pay, the water agencies who are going to pay. Some water agencies or some of the entities involved or potentially involved that say they don't want any part of it. They're opposed to it, and why don't you talk about that opposition that's come from some of the people in the water resource community?
Well, there's no question there's opposition to the program in the Delta. They don't want this for a whole variety of reasons we could get into. We haven't had any opposition from those who currently export water from the Delta, but we haven't had any support either. They, like many other people, are waiting to see what our draft documents look like, how much water they can get, what will be their costs, and all that is not final yet. So I would say they're not committed to the program yet, but they're very interested in it, and most of them are actually putting money into the planning process. There is no group that currently exports from the Delta that said they're actually opposed, as far as I know.
So the opposition comes from what water agencies that have not been participating in the export?
Yeah, the Delta ones primarily.
We have a call. Ignacio Chitella on the line. Are you there, Ignacio?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, do you have a comment or question? Hold on, we're having some technical difficulties. Oh, Ignacio, are you on a speakerphone?
No, I'm on a cell phone.
Cell phone.
I was listening to the program at the same time, but now I'm out.
I see. I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yes, hello.
You're on the air.
I'm on the air. Hello, my name is Ignacio Chapala, calling from Berkeley. I first of all want to thank you for holding this really important discussion that has come much too late for the consideration of the public of California. Seems to me like this idea has been hanging in the air, and every time it's exposed to the public, it gets rejected for good reasons. And since it is not really about an engineering project, but as a social and politics project of the state of California, I wonder if there has been any real consideration of how consumption can be reduced, especially in the South, how we can have a limit to how much growth we can have, how much real estate can be developed, and so on and so forth. And I will be thankful for any guidance as to where to look for alternatives to simply providing more and more and more water to development that should not be sustained. Thank you.
Well, I could start perhaps. It's important to know, I think, that Southern California is one of the world's leaders in water conservation and wastewater recycling, and is frankly far ahead of the Bay Area, I'm sorry to say, as a Bay Area resident, but their amount of reuse and their per capita use is really exemplary. Now, it isn't as low as it could be, and it definitely could get better, and we want it to get better, but it's very good. We also need better water conservation in the agricultural sector, but again, those who export water from the Delta are paying a lot. Their efficiencies tend to be pretty high compared to farmers, certainly nationwide. So we need to do more by way of water conservation. The city of Los Angeles has, added millions of residents without increasing its water use over the last 15 years. So we are doing these programs, but they're not sufficient. We need to do a lot more. But people are coming. We have to accommodate them, and I think we can do it with the amount of water we have today.
And what if
we... on that, if I may. Certainly, California, including Southern California, is more water efficient than they were 20 or 30 years ago when Jerry supervised me at the Department of Water Resources and actively promoted water conservation. Many of the results are from his work back then. However, there's a lot more that can be done. The same California Department of Water Resources we used to work for, as they have updated their state water plan, has identified literally millions of acre-feet of recycled water and conservation potential that's not being realized. And for those folks concerned about climate change, even if these tunnels in the Delta flow partially by gravity, this water will still be the most energy-intensive source of water. Compare that to water conservation, which is actually usually a net energy improvement. Water recycling, using half or less the energy of pumping water all the way from Northern California. So yes, there's much that has been done, but study after study has shown that there is tremendous untapped potential. We think by using that potential and looking at some of the agricultural possibilities that it will be possible to achieve reduced diversions from the Delta, keeping more fresh water to restore that ecosystem.
Let's talk about, we're soon going to run out of time. Let us talk about one group that you've mentioned, this Bay Delta group that is an oversight group. Give it the name and tell us about it.
So that's called the Delta Stewardship Council. It was created in the 2009 legislation, the Delta Reform Act. There are 7 members appointed by the governor and the speaker and so on and so forth. And they supervise all activities in the Delta. So if you have a land use change, it might go through the Delta Protection Commission, which is another body, but it ends up at the Delta Stewardship Council. And they also will have to approve this plan. This plan, when it's finished and approved by our State Department of Fish and Wildlife, will have to go before the Delta Stewardship Council through an appeal process and be approved by them. And they have very high standards they have to meet. They have to meet these, reduced reliance on the Delta standards and water conservation and so on. So that'll be a level of review that the plan will have to go through. They're doing a lot more. They have just recently issued what's called the Delta Plan itself, the Delta Plan. And if you go to their website, you can see that plan. It's also quite long, but pretty easy to read, and they have summary documents. But unfortunately, that plan is being litigated by virtually every interest group who feels that they have been abused. The landowners, the exporters, some of the conservation groups all feel that the plan was inadequate one way or the other, which may be a sign that adding them all up together, it is adequate. We'll find out. But anyway, it's a very important body, and Phil Eisenberg, the former assemblyman from Sacramento, former mayor of Sacramento, is the chair of that body.
So we not only have a bay development and conservation plan, but we have a Delta plan, so they shouldn't be confused.
That's right. That's right.
And the Delta plan is just focused on preservation in the Delta?
No, it's everything. And so our plan, our Bay Delta Conservation Plan, if it's approved by the biological agencies, will become part of, just one piece of, the overall Delta plan.
So that this complex plan that you're heading up, or complex effort that you're heading up, is only one part of an even more complex effort. Somehow the notion of human engineering that goes on just seems to be so staggering. It's hard to keep it all in place.
Yes, it is. And there are other Delta bodies. I think we have 4 or 5 state agencies who are primarily or entirely devoted on the Delta. It's probably the most governmentized piece of real estate on the planet.
One thing I'd like to throw in is I understand the tunnels themselves will take 10 years to construct.
Oh, probably something like that.
But the ecological protection will go over and be implemented over 50 years.
That's right. That's right. Starting right away.
And to add to the complexity or the complexity of coming up with a solution, let me give you a scale. As Jerry mentioned, this BDCP, the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, that's this current round, has been going on for 7 years. The cost so far is about $250 million.
Just for planning.
Process.
Right.
And this is why I think it's costing so much. In this case, the Jerry Brown administration kind of inherited BDCP from the Schwarzenegger administration. And contrary to the advice of some, including the Planning and Conservation League, what they did is they started off with the project they wanted, and then they've been trying to explain or justify or scientifically demonstrate how it could work. And again, in the past 7 years, the cost has gone up from $3 billion to $25 billion. The permitting challenges have become greater, not less. The scientific questions have not gone away. And so it's really hard to kind of thread the needle or find the sweet spot with this effort. You commented that there's a plethora of other efforts underway. There's also a Delta Protection Commission. There's a Delta Conservancy. There's the Department of Fish and Wildlife. There are numerous federal agencies with a hand in this kitchen. And we think that by inheriting a kind of let's figure out they figured out the project they wanted and then trying to justify it, it has made it difficult for the water exporters, the people who would get the water, to objectively look at alternatives like how much increased water conservation could be achieved and how would that affect the diversions from the Delta. Yes, there's scientific uncertainty. Using the kind of what's known as the precautionary principle, I guess our first concern is, as they tell physicians, the first priority is do no harm. We think we could do better than do no harm, but it really requires that kind of comprehensive look at what we can do in things like conservation, recycling, yes, some habitat restoration in the Delta, and other measures.
Jerry, do you?
Well, we're trying to do that. The project has changed a lot. It was originally proposed to be 15,000 cubic feet per second, but in 2011, we got a letter signed by the Natural Resources Defense Council, Planning and Conservation League, and many others saying you should reduce the size of the tunnels from 15,000 to 9,000. And after a lot of thought and consultation, we actually responded positively to that request, and we did reduce it from 15,000 to 9,000. That is not to say we've selected an alternative. Under the California Environmental Quality Act, you have to be very careful not to pre-decide what you're doing. And so we have the proposed project of 9,000, but we're willing to look at the 3,000 Jonas described and several other sizes. But we did reduce the proposed project from 15 to 9 at the request of most of the conservation groups.
The other part of the complexity that we've sort of mentioned, but that should be fully understood, is the number of agencies that have to sign off. I heard 100 have to be. Is that?
I don't know if it's 100, but it's a lot. We have the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. EPA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, our own Fish and Wildlife Department, the Central Valley Flood Board. It goes on and on. But this is a highly complex project. It's a huge project, and we have a lot of regulations to make sure it's done right, so that's not a problem.
Do you think that it will be underway by the time before Jerry leaves office?
Yes, because I'm confident that if he runs for re-election, he'll be re-elected, and so we've got 5 years to go, and so I would say yes.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up. We want to thank Jonas. Let me give you some final words. Would you like to mention?
We certainly, as I said, agree that things need to be done in the Delta. We think that the BDCP process could be improved. The only way one really gets to a solution, and it's a solution for time, the only way you get to that is by involving people, bringing them in, getting some agreement, some acquiescence. Currently, there is so substantial opposition to the program as it's currently described that, being a water developer in the past myself, I just can't see how they bring this to a finish.
Well, I'm going to have to thank Jerry Meral here and Jonas Minton for joining us on Post Carbon. And we intend to have another program on the Delta Tunnel Plan on the second Monday of the month, August 26th. So we'll be going into it in a little more depth and with Bernie Steffen. And thank you, Herb, for joining me today.
Well, it's always a pleasure to talk to Jerry and others about this. I always walk away from it staggered.
Thank you, Jonas.
My pleasure.
Okay, you can listen to archive podcast of our program on kwpostcarbon.com. And I want to give you, tell us that website where people can get more information.
Just Google Bay Delta Conservation Plan, all one word, and you'll get as much information as you need.